The galaxy had seen empires rise and fall like tides. The Vreth Dominion had conquered 40 star systems in a single century. The Kalem Collective had built ring worlds around dying suns. The Sereni Commonwealth had mapped the edges of the known universe and planted their banners there. Every one of these civilizations had, at some point, looked down at a small blue planet in an unremarkable solar system and laughed. They stopped laughing eventually. It began, as most things did, with first contact. The Vreth were the first to find Earth. Their long-range scout ships detected the electromagnetic noise bleeding off the planet's surface, radio waves, television signals, the messy digital chatter of a species that had no idea anyone was listening. The Vreth High Council reviewed the data and sent a diplomatic envoy, mostly out of curiosity. They expected to find something primitive, something manageable, maybe a species worth trading with, or absorbing into the lower tiers of the Dominion as a labor class. Ambassador Vrethka landed his vessel in the middle of what the humans called a desert, broadcasting a greeting signal on every frequency his ship could produce. Within 6 hours, he was surrounded. Not by soldiers, not by weapons, by journalists. Humans with cameras and microphones pressed against the security barrier his crew had hastily erected, shouting questions in at least a dozen different languages. Behind them were military vehicles, yes, but also food trucks. Someone had set up a merchandise stand selling shirts that read, "We come in peace," before Vrethka had even stepped off the ramp. A child had somehow gotten past the barrier and was asking his communications officer if she wanted to try a snack called a chuo. Vrethka filed his report that evening with slightly shaking hands. "They are not afraid," he wrote. "I have made first contact with 11 species. Every single one reacted with either terror or aggression. These creatures reacted with commerce and curiosity. I am not sure which is more unsettling." The Vreth Council read the report, dismissed it as the ramblings of an overwhelmed diplomat, and sent a follow-up team with a more formal offer. They proposed that Earth join the Dominion as a protected world, a generous offer, they believed, that no primitive species had ever refused. The humans asked for the terms in writing, had what appeared to be a lengthy internal argument about it on something called the Internet, and then sent back a counteroffer with 47 amendments. The Vreth had never received a counteroffer before. It took 3 years of negotiation before the Vreth simply gave up and agreed to a mutual non-interference treaty, which was itself a first. They left the encounter with the unsettling feeling that they had not, in any meaningful sense, won. News of Earth spread through the galactic community the way strange news always did, slowly at first, then all at once. The Kalem Collective sent their own observers, more scientific in their approach. They wanted to study the humans rather than negotiate with them. They positioned a cloaked research station in Earth's outer orbit and began watching. What they saw confused them deeply. Humans, they noted, were physically unremarkable. They had no natural armor. Their sensory organs were mediocre by galactic standards, nearly blind in infrared, deaf to ranges that half the known species communicated in, with a sense of smell that would embarrass most quadrupeds. They lived short lives. They got sick easily. They needed vast quantities of a specific liquid just to survive a single rotation of their planet. And yet, the Kalem researchers watched humans run, not from predators, just for fun. They watched them lift heavy objects repeatedly without any clear goal. They watched a human male fall from a considerable height, break several bones, and, after a period of recovery, attempt the same activity again. They reviewed human history and found it was essentially an unbroken record of humans encountering things that could kill them and then figuring out how to make those things work for them instead. Fire, flood, ice ages, predators that outweighed them by several hundred kilograms, diseases that had wiped out nearly a third of their population at various points. Each time, the humans had adapted, rebuilt, and in many cases come out stronger and angrier than before. Lead researcher Kalem, 7 sent a priority message back to the collective science division. "We have been studying the wrong metrics," she wrote. "We looked at their physical capabilities and found them wanting. We should have been looking at their psychological profile. These creatures do not process danger the way other species do. Where most sentient life forms develop increasingly sophisticated methods of avoiding threats, humans appear to have developed increasingly sophisticated methods of running toward them. The collective's response was to request more data. Calum, 7 sent more data. The response after that was a long institutional silence that, in the Calum language, roughly translated to, "We need to think about this." The Sereni Commonwealth had a different approach entirely. They were a species of diplomats and historians. Where the Vreth used power and the Calum used science, the Sereni used information. They had archives stretching back 200,000 years. They had watched dozens of civilizations rise, make contact with the wider galaxy, and either integrate peacefully or tear themselves apart in the process. They found humans in their records, which surprised them. Not because humans had been spacefaring. They hadn't been, not at the time the oldest records were made, but because another species, long extinct, had briefly surveyed Earth and left notes. The notes were not encouraging. Dangerous fauna, the survey had read. Apex predators on every continent. Recommend bypass. The survey team had flagged Earth as a planet to avoid and moved on. What the Sereni found interesting was the timeline. When that original survey had been conducted, humans had been using stone tools. In the time between then and now, while the Sereni had maintained their careful, steady civilization and the Vreth had built their empire and the Calum had constructed their ring worlds, humans had gone from rocks to rockets in what was, by galactic standards, the blink of an eye. The Sereni chief historian pulled up the development curve and stared at it for a long time. No other species had a curve like that. Most civilizations grew steadily. Some grew quickly. None grew like this. This sharp, almost violent upward line that looked less like development and more like an explosion caught in slow motion. Pull everything we have on human conflict history, the historian told her team. They pulled it. They read it. 3 researchers requested reassignment afterward. Humans, it turned out, had spent most of their history fighting each other. Not small skirmishes. Not border disputes. They had fought wars that reshaped continents, that killed hundreds of millions, that they had named and numbered and studied, and then, crucially, tried very hard not to repeat. The trying not to repeat part was what the Sereni found most alarming, because it meant humans were capable of looking at the worst things they had ever done and instead of being broken by the memory, treating it as a lesson. They had built institutions specifically designed to prevent themselves from destroying each other. Those institutions were imperfect and frequently argued over and sometimes failed entirely. But they existed, and they kept being rebuilt every time they fell apart. The Sereni had a term for civilizations that consistently rebuilt after collapse. They called them persistent threats. In 200,000 years of records, they had documented fewer than a dozen. Humanity was the youngest by 60,000 years. By the time the first human ships left the solar system, small, fragile things by galactic standards, crewed by beings who had no idea what waited for them, 3 of the galaxy's largest powers had already been quietly, separately, and urgently discussing what to do about them. The Vreth wanted to contain them while it was still possible. The Calum wanted to study them from a safe distance. The Sereni, older and perhaps wiser, wanted to do something none of them had ever seriously considered before. They wanted to talk to them. Honestly, before things got complicated. It was already too late for that. The first human ship to reach another star system was called the Endurance. It was not a warship. It was not even a particularly impressive vessel by the standards of the species that watched it crawl across the void. The Vreth, whose patrol routes crossed that sector of space, tracked it for several weeks before deciding what to do. The ship was underpowered. Its hull plating was uneven. Its weapons, and it did have weapons, which was noted with interest, were small, short-ranged, and looked like they had been designed by engineers who were working from theoretical models rather than actual combat experience. By every measurable standard, the Endurance was not a threat. And yet the Vreth patrol commander, a veteran of 3 border wars, found herself holding a very long meeting with her officers about whether to approach it. "It's one ship," said her second-in-command. "Yes," she agreed. "With a crew of 22. "Yes." "With weapons that couldn't crack the plating on a scout vessel." "Also yes." The meeting continued for another 2 hours. In the end, she transmitted a greeting and waited. The response came back in less than a minute. The humans had apparently been ready for contact, had prepared translations in 6 galactic trade languages, and wanted to know if the Vreth ship needed any assistance because they had noticed what they described as unusual harmonic output from one of the patrol vessel's secondary drives. The commander stared at that last line for a very long time. Her secondary drive did have an unusual harmonic output. It was a minor issue, one her engineers had flagged but deprioritized. The humans, in a ship with sensors considerably less sophisticated than her own, had noticed it before she had formally introduced herself. She filed another report. The Vreth High Council was developing a large collection of unsettling reports about humans. The Endurance crew, for their part, had no idea any of this was happening. Captain Yawanda Osemensa and her 21 crewmates were simply trying to do their jobs, which involved making contact, collecting data, and not dying. They had trained for 5 years. They had read everything available about the Vreth, which was not much, and filled in the gaps with careful guesswork. When the patrol vessel responded to their greeting, Osemensa gathered her crew in the common room, gave a short speech that she had also prepared 5 years ago and slightly revised 3 times since launch, and then opened the channel. What followed was 6 hours of the most exhausting diplomatic conversation any of the 22 humans had ever had. The Vreth were formal to the point of rigidity. Every exchange followed a specific protocol. Every statement required a counterstatement. There were questions about Earth's position on roughly 40 galactic conventions that the humans had never heard of, followed by a very long explanation of what those conventions were, followed by the humans asking for the texts so they could review them, followed by a Vreth officer actually laughing, a sound like gravel in a pipe, because no species had ever asked for the text before. "You don't trust our summary?" the Vreth commander asked. "We trust it fine," said Osemensa. "We just like to read things ourselves." Another report was filed. The Endurance continued its mission, made contact with 2 more species over the following months, and returned to Earth carrying enough information to keep every university on the planet busy for a decade. The crew were celebrated. More ships were built. They were still small and impractical by galactic standards, but there were more of them now, and they went in more directions. The galactic community watched this expansion with a mixture of fascination and growing unease. It was the Kalem who first raised the issue formally. They called a session of the Interstellar Coordination Forum, a body that was less a government and more a very large group chat between powerful civilizations, and presented their accumulated research on humanity. The presentation was thorough. It covered biology, history, psychology, and the Endurance encounter. It also covered something that no one had formally raised yet: human creativity. Kalem, 7, who had been promoted 3 times since her original observation post above Earth, presented her team's findings on human art, music, and storytelling. She had expected this section to be the least alarming part of her presentation. She had been wrong. Humans, she explained, told stories about things that hadn't happened yet. Not prophecy. Every species had some version of that. This was different. Humans imagined futures in extraordinary detail, and then used those imagined futures as blueprints. They had written stories about traveling to other stars before they could leave their own atmosphere. They had described diseases before they understood how diseases worked. They had imagined machines, weapons, medicines, and social structures that hadn't existed yet, and then, with a frequency that defied statistical expectation, built them. She showed the forum a list of human fictional works and the real technologies that had followed them, sometimes by decades. The list was long. The forum was quiet. "They dream in engineering specifications," Kalem, 7 said. "We have no equivalent. For us, imagination and planning are separate functions. For humans, they appear to be the same function." The Sereni representative, an elderly being named Archivist Thessan, had been quiet through most of the presentation. Now he spoke. "You're describing a species that practices the future," he said. "That is a more precise way of putting it, yes. And their current level of spacefaring capability is what it is because they haven't been doing it long, not because they've reached their limit." "Correct." The forum asked for a recess. Several delegations used the recess to have very private conversations that they did not include in the official record. The Vreth representative contacted his High Council with a one-line message: "We should have contained them sooner." The Council's response was longer and more complicated, because the question of how one contained a species that had already been contacted by 3 powers was actively expanding, and had demonstrated a remarkable tendency to notice things they weren't supposed to notice was not a simple one. The Vreth were good at power. They were not especially good at subtlety. They tried anyway. Over the following 2 years, Vreth vessels began appearing near human trade routes with increasing frequency, not blocking them. That would have been an act of war, and even the most aggressive voices in the High Council agreed they weren't ready for that conversation, but present, visible. A reminder of size and strength that had worked on every other species the Vreth had encountered. The humans noticed immediately. They began publishing detailed tracking reports of Vreth vessel movements in their public communications networks. Not classified, public. Any Vreth intelligence analyst with access to human news archives could read exactly what the humans had observed and when. The message underneath the data was not subtle. We see you, we are not frightened, and we are telling everyone. One analyst described it as the most aggressive act of passive documentation I have ever witnessed. The High Council debated for 3 months and then quietly pulled the patrol vessels back. It was the second time they had backed down from humans. The fact that no shots had been fired made it somehow worse. Meanwhile, something else was happening that none of the major powers had anticipated. The smaller species, the ones who had been quietly existing under the shadow of the Vreth Dominion and the Kalem Collective and the Sereni Commonwealth for generations, had started watching humanity very carefully. Not with fear, with something closer to hope. Because humans, it turned out, were constitutionally incapable of passing a smaller species in trouble without stopping to ask if they needed help. It wasn't a policy. It wasn't strategic. The first time it happened, it appeared to be almost reflexive. A human survey vessel came across a Drothi colony ship that had suffered catastrophic engine failure and spent 2 weeks helping them make emergency repairs before any formal request had been made. The Drothi were a minor species, no strategic value, no political connections. The humans helped them anyway. Word traveled, as word does. The Drothi told their neighbors. Their neighbors told theirs. In the informal networks that ran beneath the official channels of galactic diplomacy, a quiet consensus was forming. The humans were strange and intense and moved through the universe like they had somewhere to be. But they noticed when something was wrong, and they did something about it, even when they didn't have to. That, in some ways, was the most alarming thing of all. Because a species with the development curve of humanity, the stubbornness of humanity, and the loyalty of humanity was not a problem that solved itself. It was a problem that grew. The Drothi were not a military power. They had 3 colony worlds, a merchant fleet of moderate size, and a diplomatic tradition built entirely around avoiding conflict wherever possible. For 200 years, they had survived in the shadow of larger civilizations by being useful and unobtrusive. When the human survey vessel helped repair their drifting colony ship, the Drothi Council had been grateful, certainly, but they had also been careful. You did not get to exist for 2 centuries in contested space by accepting favors without understanding what they cost. They sent a formal thank you delegation to the nearest human outpost. What they expected was a conversation about terms. What they got was a welcome party, a meal that involved an alarming number of unfamiliar spices, and a human administrator named Prefect Jonas Hartley, who spent most of the evening asking questions about Drothi architecture. The delegation returned home deeply confused and spent several weeks trying to decode the encounter. They wanted nothing, reported the delegation's head, a diplomat named Vorathen, to the Drothi Council. I waited for the trade proposal. There was no trade proposal. I waited for the political request. There was no political request. Prefect Hartley gave me a book about human buildings and asked me to send him photographs of ours. That's all. He also gave me something called a recipe for a dish. He said I could try making it if I wanted. The council was silent for a moment. What did the recipe require? Several ingredients we don't have, but he included substitutions. Vorathin took the posting as Drothi ambassador to human space, and over the following 3 years sent back reports that were regularly flagged by the council's senior analysts as requiring multiple readings to fully process. Humans, she documented, were simultaneously the most informal and most committed species she had ever dealt with. They said things like, "Let me know if you need anything." And then, when you actually needed something, they showed up. Every time, without invoking debts or adjusting terms or attaching conditions. It was, Vorathin wrote in one particularly memorable report, like doing diplomacy with someone who has never heard that favors are supposed to be transactional. The Sereni archivist Thesson read that report. He had made a habit of reading everything that came through unofficial channels about human interactions with minor species. He added it to a growing file that he kept separate from the official forum archives. The file was very large. The Vreth noticed the pattern too, though they interpreted it differently. In Vreth diplomatic theory, building goodwill with minor species served one purpose: expanding your coalition before a conflict. The Vreth had done it themselves before every major military campaign. They looked at the human interactions with the Droathi, and then the Marate, and then the small collective of silicon-based beings known as the Choir, and they saw a preparation for war so patient and methodical that it was almost admirable. They sent an urgent message to the Kalem requesting a private summit. The summit was held on a neutral station at the edge of Serene space. The Vreth representative, High Negotiator Sol Vreth, laid out his case with the blunt clarity his species preferred. Humanity was building alliances. The alliances were with minor species, yes, but minor species had territory, and territory had resources, and resources had strategic value. If allowed to continue, the humans would arrive at a position of genuine galactic power not through conquest, but through something that the Vreth found much harder to counter: genuine affection. You can't threaten your way out of being liked, Solvreth said. Kalem Coordinator Pren 9 was quiet for a moment. You've tried threatening them, she said. How did that work? The Vreth representative did not answer. The answer was in the record. The Serene delegate, a young historian named Talvas who had been given this assignment specifically because archivist Thesson thought the experience would be valuable, listened to the exchange and took very careful notes. He had read Thesson's private file. He had also read something the other two delegations apparently hadn't: a comprehensive study of human conflict resolution, published by a human university, titled Why Cooperation Persists in High-Stakes Environments. The study's argument, stripped of its academic language, was simple. Humans cooperated not because it was always strategically optimal, but because they had learned, repeatedly and at great cost, that the alternative was worse. Every major human catastrophe had, eventually, produced a generation of humans who rebuilt the institutions that had failed and tried to make them stronger. The species had a mechanism built into its culture that processed disaster as information. Most species processed disaster as trauma. Humans did that too. Talvas had read their literature. He knew it wasn't simple, but they also, somehow, held the lesson alongside the wound. They grieved and they remembered, and then they built something that might, possibly, make the grief less likely to happen again. He wanted to say this at the summit. He had been instructed not to offer analysis unless asked. He was asked, eventually, because the summit was going nowhere. Solvreth wanted a containment strategy. Pren 9 wanted more research time. The two positions were incompatible, and both representatives knew it. What does the Serene position recommend? Pren 9 asked, mostly to fill the silence. Talvas looked at his notes. He put them down. We recommend contact, he said. Direct, honest, comprehensive contact. Tell them what we've been doing. Tell them about the observation posts, and the patrol patterns, and the forum discussions. All of it. Solvreth stared at him. You want to confess? I want to communicate. There's a difference. But yes, it involves telling them the truth. And you think that will make them less dangerous? I think it will make them less surprised when they find out themselves. And they will find out. They always find out. The room was quiet. Everyone present knew about the patrol report. Everyone knew about the tracking documentation. The humans hadn't confronted anyone about it. They had simply made it public, calmly and completely, which in some ways was more unnerving than a confrontation would have been. Solvreth asked for a recess. He spent the recess contacting the High Council, who spent their time contacting their intelligence division, who spent their time reviewing how much the humans likely already knew and coming back with a number that made several senior officers sit down very suddenly. The summit reconvened. The Vreth position had shifted. Back on Earth, none of this was visible to ordinary people. What was visible was a generation of young humans who had grown up knowing the galaxy existed. They had grown up reading about the Endurance, watching the footage of Osimensua's first Vreth contact, following the news from Droathi space and Marate territory, and the strange, beautiful transmissions that came from the Choir. They had grown up knowing they were not alone, and they had processed that knowledge in the characteristically human way by wanting to go see for themselves. The second generation of human deep space vessels was larger and better built. Their crews were more experienced. Their diplomatic training was more rigorous, built on hard lessons from the first contacts and refined by the minor species relationships that had been generating data for years. They went further. They found more. And they found something no one expected them to find. The ruins of a civilization that had been wiped out approximately 90,000 years ago. The ruins stretched across 3 systems. The destruction had been total and, based on the evidence, deliberate. Something had decided this species needed to stop existing and had been thorough about it. The human archaeological team spent 8 months at the site. They documented everything. They identified what appeared to be the source of the attack, a pattern in the debris that pointed toward a region of space that several galactic powers had, through tacit agreement, never discussed in formal channels. When the report was published, publicly, in full, as humans always did, the forum went into emergency session. Not because of the ruins. The major powers knew about the ruins. That was the problem. The emergency session of the Interstellar Coordination Forum was the most attended in its 400-year history. Every major power sent their highest representative. Most minor species sent someone too, because news of the human archaeological report had moved through unofficial channels faster than any official communication. And every civilization in the galaxy, with any sense of self-preservation, wanted to know what was about to happen. What was about to happen, archivist Thesson had decided, was the most important conversation the forum had ever had. He had spent 30 years preparing for it without knowing it. He was old now, by his species' standards. Old enough to remember the first Vreth report about a planet full of journalists and merchandise stands. And he intended to say what needed to be said clearly enough that no amount of institutional cowardice could misrepresent it afterward. He requested to speak first. His seniority gave him that right. The humans found the Ethon ruins, he said, without preamble, and published everything they found. They identified the impact vector. They identified the source region. They have not yet identified the specific civilization responsible, because that information has been deliberately removed from every accessible archive in the galaxy. He paused. Every archive except ours. The Sereni have kept a complete record. The silence in the chamber was the kind that had weight. We are prepared to share that record, Thesson continued, with the full forum, including the human delegation. Another pause. I recommend we do this before the humans find the information themselves, because they will find it. They are already looking. Salvreth, who was not young anymore either, looked at his hands. He had known about the Ethon. Most of the senior figures in the room had. The destruction of the Ethon had happened 90,000 years ago, committed by a civilization that no longer existed. They had destroyed themselves, in the end, which the Sereni records noted with a grim sort of completeness. But the cover-up was more recent. A collective decision, made 400 years ago, when the Forum had been young and the major powers had agreed that some history was dangerous to circulate. The Ethon had been a persistent threat. The species that destroyed them had not wanted others to study the Ethon too carefully and draw lessons. The Forum had agreed. It had been a political decision made by political beings operating under the belief that they knew better than the species they were making it for. The Human Report had 37,000 downloads in its first week. The number was still climbing. Thesson sat down. The chamber began talking all at once, which was not procedurally allowed but happened anyway, and the forum chair spent 20 minutes restoring order. When order was restored, it was Pren 9 who spoke, and she spoke with an exhaustion that translated cleanly across species lines. We have spent over a decade, she said, trying to understand what to do about humans. We have observed them, tracked them, debated them, and tried to contain them. I want to formally acknowledge that none of those approaches worked. And I want to propose that the reason none of them worked is because we were asking the wrong question. She looked at the human delegation. There were 3 of them. Ambassador Osamensa, who had been captain of the Endurance and was now gray-haired and carrying herself with the particular calm of someone who had spent 20 years being the most surprised person in every room and had stopped being surprised. A young Xeno-diplomat named Reyes who had grown up on the Drothi reports and had studied every first contact record available, and Vorathen, who was not human but had been serving as a bridge diplomat for long enough that she thought in human sentence structures when she was tired. We were asking how to manage humanity, Prin, Nine said. We should have been asking how to work with them. Minsa waited until it was her turn to speak, which took a while because several other delegations had things to say first, and forum procedure was forum procedure. When she finally stood up, she did what she had always done in rooms full of beings who were nervous about her species. She kept it simple. We know about the surveillance, she said. We've known for years. We know about the patrol patterns and the forum sessions and the containment debates. We've read everything we could find. We didn't make it an issue because we didn't think making it an issue would be useful. She looked around the room. We understand why you were worried. If we'd encountered a species like us, we'd probably have been worried too. The admission produced a specific quality of silence. Not the heavy silence from before. Something more like relief, cautious and uncertain, but present. What we want, she continued, is the same thing we've always wanted. We want to know what's out there. We want to understand it. We want to make sure that what happened to the Ethon doesn't happen to anyone else. She paused. We're not an empire. We don't want to be one. Empires are something we've tried. It went badly every time. Reyes, who had been sitting very still, allowed himself a small breath. He had helped draft the speech. He had argued for the last line for 3 days. He was glad it had made it in. What followed was 3 days of negotiation so complex that the forum's translation systems flagged 11 instances of concepts that didn't have equivalents in cross-species standard. The Serini opened their full Ethon archive. The Vreth, after a very long internal deliberation, acknowledged the patrol patterns formally and agreed to a framework that prohibited surveillance without consent. The Calum offered research partnership access in exchange for something they had wanted for 2 years but hadn't known how to ask for: permission to set up a formal study program of humans, with human awareness and cooperation. The humans agreed, with amendments. There were always amendments. The Druathi ambassador, watching from the minor species gallery, transmitted a message to Vorathin's private channel. Was this what you expected? Vorathin thought about it. I stopped expecting specific things from humans about 6 years ago, she sent back. Now I just try to keep up. The formal agreement was signed at the end of the 3rd day. It established a framework for human participation in the forum, not as a managed entity or a monitored species, but as a full member with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. It was the fastest any species had ever moved from first contact to full membership. The previous record had been 40 years. The humans had done it in 14. Archivist Thes San, signing the document for the Serini, allowed himself something that was, for his species, the equivalent of a smile. He had told his students for decades that history was not a record of the past. It was a map of the future. You read it not to see where you had been, but to understand where you were going. He had read a great deal of human history. He had known, in the way old historians sometimes knew things that they couldn't quite prove, that this day was coming. What he hadn't known, what he admitted, now, was the thing that had kept him studying longer and harder than any of his colleagues, was how it would feel. It felt, he decided, like the beginning of something. Outside the station, in the dark between the stars, human ships continued their outward arc. They went in every direction. They stopped when something needed fixing. They asked questions. They shared what they found. They dreamed in engineering specifications and built the dreams, imperfectly and persistently, and with an absolute refusal to accept that the current version was the final one. The alien leaders had feared them. Some still did. Fear, Thesson reflected, was not always wrong. Sometimes fear was just recognition, the deep, accurate understanding that something in your world had changed and would not be changing back. The galaxy had seen empires rise and fall. It had seen powers consolidate and collapse. It had cataloged hundreds of civilizations in the long Serini records and noted, with the careful neutrality of archivists, which ones had lasted and which had not. The ones that lasted, he had noticed, were almost never the ones that scared everyone else into submission. They were the ones that, somehow, made everyone else want to keep showing up. Humanity had been in space for 14 years. It had no ring worlds, no conquered territories, no throne. It had something harder to build and harder to take away. And the galaxy, slowly, uncertainly, and with the particular caution of those who have been surprised before, was beginning to understand that this had always been the thing worth being afraid of.